Greetings and welcome to the first episode of Bioethics in Motion. My name is Benoît Muche and my formal education is that of a medical imagery technologist with final project in bioethics. That's over 10 years ago. Since then I've read many resources and explore the issues surrounding life and how to engage technology, society in relation to life. Now I'm a professional photographer, but I'm starting this new project and the subjects of today will be first the extension of the law on euthanasia to minors, children in Belgium. We're going to explore what's the law about, what it implies and what it means. And then we're going to discuss the Standford experiment, which was an experiment where normal people were to play guards and prisoners in artificial settings and to study how abuse takes place. And finally, the moral violence in the workplace and how to protect yourself from burnouts, from bringing stress from work onto your family and things like that. So I hope you enjoy this show and I will catch you after the interviews. What do you think about the extension of euthanasia law to minors and why? Well, right now in the chambers we debate about the extension of access to euthanasia for minors without any limits of age. So a child of 8 or 10 will be able, according to the new law, request and obtain that his days to be put on an end actively, in the fact by lethal injection. That's the extension of the access to euthanasia to children. There are several problems with this extension. First, you can wonder if a child of 8 or 10 years old won't be influenced by his parents. The experience shows that it's the parents who suffer to see their children in a state of suffering, extremely difficult state, in a state of incurable disease, and the child, seeing the distress, the suffering of his parents, risks to be influenced by them, and seeing the suffering inflicts on them, request that his days to be put to an end. That's the first problem, the capacity of discernment of the child. Of course, the law predicts that you have to ask a pedopsychiatrist or a psychologist. The psychologist must not be a specialist of children, who must say if the child is capable of discernment. But if the first psychologist or pedopsychiatrist says no, nothing prevents the doctor in charge, to whom the request is made, to ask another, and so on. Also, there is another problem that the doctors and pediatrists that I met say that we have by now, by palliative care means to relieve suffering. There are painkillers, there are drugs that can calm anxiety and so forth. And if all else fails, you can always put a patient to sleep, the small patient, in a reversible fashion. He is in a deep sleep and doesn't suffer. The doctors also say that, of course, the diagnosis of incurable disease are usually reliable, but not always. There are terminal disease patients who have healed. So there's always a risk that patients are known to be incurable eventually heal. Next, pedopsychiatrists and psychologists say that the evaluation of discernment capacity cannot be made objectively. There is no list of objective criteria to evaluate that capacity of a child in a great fragility state, great dependence, suffering, to evaluate if the child is well aware that what his request is and what's gonna obtain. And finally, I think that this law is useless because in the facts there are very few requests from children for their days to be put to an end. There are sometimes requests by parents, but there are no requests from children. What we fear is that we move progressively to euthanasia for larger layers of population. In this way, we're gonna probably extend the law, the access to all people who are no longer aware of themselves. Also for children who are born in a heavy handicap, and of course for a demented person or a newborn you cannot ask their opinion, so we're gonna see the evolution of the law towards the access of euthanasia to people who didn't explicitly make that request. Of course for demented people, for all people who are no longer aware of themselves, you need an anticipated declaration, but who's gonna judge if that person is demented or not? Will be always someone external. So on the basis of anticipated declaration, it will always be a third person who will decide if the person should be euthanized. And by this, I think we're going beyond the spirit of the euthanasia law of 2002, who insisted on the autonomy in the decision by the person. About the children who are terminal and where a medical team decided that discernment and the issue of their disease is fatal and they cannot be relieved by palliative care. How would be forbidding euthanasia be better than deep sleep states? I think that sedation, deep sleep, is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is always a homicide, so you actively kill a patient or person supposedly under request. When you put a patient to sleep, you let the disease go on, and maybe you have healing in rare cases. So you avoid to commit an act that is not reversible.
Voilà, Nadia Geerts, bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Que pensez-vous de l'extension de la législation sur l'euthanasie aux mineurs et pourquoi?
I am totally favorable to the extension of this law, and I don't understand why it provokes so much controversy. For me, the question is exactly the same as for euthanasia of adults, meaning that from the moment someone is at the end of their life, you know there is no more hope for healing, and this person request for themselves that they're suffering to be cut short. I don't see the name of what. It would be denied to them, whether they are children or adults. What do you think about the argument of some people who say that children could lack discernment, and or that children could be tempted to request this outcome because they see the distress in their parents' eyes, and in fact, by proxy, it's the parents who push for this outcome using affective blackmail? I don't understand, because people talk a little like euthanasia was like assisted suicide, but it's not that at all. You don't have a kid feeling unwell and saying, hey guys, just cut my suffering short, and people say, oh, he said, we're gonna do it. You always talk about someone in a terminal disease state. The outcome of the disease is lethal at the short and middle term. So anyway, again, maybe there is some dishonesty of some people or a huge misunderstanding from those people that mention what you said. about the affective blackmail. Again, it's true that maybe some parents would be so feel so helpless in front of the children suffering that they just want one thing is that it ends as fast as possible, and that the kids might feel that okay, maybe why not, but at the risk of appearing a little cynic, if anyway the outcome is that, if does a few days or a few weeks more change the game. And also I think parents love their children enough not to take this kind of decision lightly, and not without being sure that there's nothing else left to do.
Professeur Scalliet, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Que pensez-vous de l'extension de la possibilité de demander l'euthanasie dans la législation aux mineurs, et pourquoi?
Alors,
So,
si vous me demandez quelle
if
est
you
ma position
ask
par rapport
what
à
is my
l'euthanasie,
position about euthanasia,
je pense que personne
I think
ne
no one is for euthanasia.
pas souhaiter
You
l'euthanasie.
cannot wish euthanasia.
Et
And
je peux pas.
I cannot.
Je peux éventuellement
Maybe I can
décider pour moi-même,
decide for
si,
myself if,
dans une
given a
situation
situation, desperate situation, I would request for euthanasia or not. But I cannot do this request on behalf of someone else. And thus, when you question euthanasia, in fact, the true question is about the
qui
freedom
entoure la demande d'euthanasie.
surrounding euthanasia.
Et cette liberté, certainement,
This
je pense
freedom
que c'est
certainly
un acquis
is a huge progress.
La liberté de demander
The
l'euthanasie
freedom to request euthanasia rests on one of the essential principles of ethics and modern bioethics, that is autonomy, in which no one is in better position to judge a situation than oneself when it's concerning oneself. And I'm certainly favorable to the freedom, to that freedom.
Le deuxième élément,
The second element is that
dans l'euthanasie,
in euthanasia,
il y a deux personnes.
there are two people.
Et donc faire une demande
And
d'euthanasie en
so
étant seul, ça
doing
n'a évidemment pas d'objet. Cette demande
euthanasia
d'euthanasie
request
est
alone doesn't mean
adressée
anything.
à quelqu'un.
This request is
donc,
sent to someone.
Il y a
So
un aspect
there is an authority aspect that is very important, extremely important, that someone is requesting euthanasia to another person, and that other person will answer to that request for euthanasia. And when we talk about the law about euthanasia, you hear about euthanasia and you hear little about request, because this request is made to someone.
Si le principe d'autonomie est
If the
le
principle of
fondement
autonomy is the basis
du droit de demander
of the right to request euthanasia, this principle of autonomy is also the right, it's also the basis of the right to grant it or not grant it.
Donc pour les enfants, certains opposants...
So about children, some opposant to the extension of the legislation mention the lack of discernment of the child, as well as the fact that palliative care are now efficient enough to relieve patients. What do you answer to those people who want to deny this right on basis that palliative care is efficient? So you're asking two questions.
Donc la première, c'est le
First is the discernment.
Alors, le discernement, c'est
Discernment
quelque chose qui
is
va être
something
apprécié
that will
à un
be
moment,
appreciated at some
par
point
rapport à une demande particulière
about a
d'un mineur
particular
particulier.
request from a particular
Et,
minor.
il faut savoir que
And you have to
en
know,
ce qui concerne la justice,
in the justice,
les
minors
mineurs sont réputés
have,
disposés de discernement,
are
comme
supposed
par
to
exemple,
have discernment
ils ont
for
commis un délit.
when, for example, they
Et,
committed a felony.
lorsque la justice,
When justice
décide qu'un
decides
mineur est
that a
responsable
minor
du délit
is
qu'il a
responsible of their
commis,
felony
il
they committed,
indique par là que ce mineur a le
they
discernement
express by that that the minor has enough discernment to understand that action they took is wrong.
C'est du même discernement dont
It's
on
the
parle.
same discernment we're talking about
Si la
here.
justice reconnaît
If the
le discernement
justice
dans le cadre des délits du
reckons
code civil,
discernment in
on
a
voit pas très bien
context
pourquoi
of
est-ce qu'on reconnaît pas le
felonies,
discernement
I don't
dans
see why
d'autres
not,
domaines.
why wouldn't
La
recognize it in
difficulté,
other
bien entendu,
domains.
c'est que,
The difficulty, of
le
course,
rôle du
is
législateur
that the
est
role
d'offrir
of the
des balises
lawmaker
qui soient
is to
lisibles
offer
par
beacons
tous.
that are readable by all.
Et
And
le discernement n'est pas une
discernment
balise qui est
is not
facile
a
à lire,
beacon easy to read,
puisqu'elle repose très fort
because
sur l'appréciation.
it's a rest on
Et,
appreciation,
en fait,
and in
on
fact,
remplace
you
un
replace is a criteria, a very simple criteria, which is the age, by a very more difficult criteria to evaluate, is that if the person doing the request of euthanasia is capable of discernment. I don't see why it cannot be solved. The second thing is about palliative care. In Belgium, when the depenalization of euthanasia was voted by the parliament in 2002, a symmetric law was also voted at the same time that organizes palliative care and their funding. And when the lawmaker, the Belgian lawmaker, looked over this problem, he wanted to express by that precisely you are wrong if you oppose euthanasia request, and maybe that is granted, to opposing it to palliative care. On behalf that good palliative care would make the need for euthanasia disappear. That's an ideology, because in the medical practice in our country, both systems coexist. At the same time, palliative care that are very well organized, with an access for patients, and funding that might not be enough, but that is already generous. And at the same time, the law of access to euthanasia allows patients who feel they don't benefit from palliative care anymore to request an euthanasia. So it's a mistake to oppose one to the other, and it's a mistake that is easily made by persons who are blocked in a system where euthanasia never had a place, and thus the only opinion they have about euthanasia is based on philosophical concepts and not on ethic concepts, meaning concept anchored at the same time in the real world and action, and opposing concepts that are only in the world of ideas. And how do we differentiate the opinion of philosophers on this subject to the opinion of doctors who work on the bioethics concept? The ones need the others, meaning everything going around euthanasia summons precise thoughts, complex thoughts, and to avoid to answer in the moment without having any personal beacon, we need philosophers and their ideas. But the philosophers' ideas do not rule the world. Their ideas allow doctors or nurses in the real world to use some concept to appreciate a situation, a given situation. In my experience, I never talk about euthanasia in general because it's an abstract concept. When I talk about it, I always think of concrete situation where the question came up and where eventually it happened or it didn't happen, because when you talk about bioethics, in reality you talk about actions. Bioethics are not a series of rules. Bioethics are application of rules in the real world.
Que pensez-vous de l'extension de la possibilité de demander l'euthanasie aux mineurs dans la nouvelle législation qui va peut-être être votée aujourd'hui, dans les grandes lignes, et pourquoi?
I think that this law will answer situations that are exceptional, because there are very few children who are going to be concerned by this law. When you interview people in contact with sick children, you realize that it's exceptional circumstances, and when you compare with what's happened in Holland, you can tell it's gonna happen the same way. In Holland, from 2002 to 2013, there were only 5 minors who were concerned by a request euthanasia and who obtained it, from which only one was under 16. It's a law for exceptional circumstances. I think the proposed law is reasonable, but the conditions in which it's going to be applied are not correct, because this is a series of amendments were proposed, and these recommendations were not considered in the law, and this is very unfortunate. What recommendations are you talking about? One that is essential is the capacity of discernment, and is from the recommendations of the Royal Academy of Medicine of Belgium, and I participate in these works, and we reach a consensus that I support. One of the big differences is that the capacity of discernment, the Academy suggests that it's evaluated by a pluridisciplinary team, but the politicians now want only to be evaluated by one pedopsychiatrist or one psychologist, one person. And we estimate that given that it's very difficult to evaluate capacity of discernment because there is no objective criteria, no score, there is no specialist of this capacity, that you absolutely need this to be evaluated by a group. It's a safety for the child, it's a safety for his parents, it's a safety for the team, it's maybe more, it's improvement in quality. So to request a pedopsychiatry or even a psychologist who is not even specialized in children, who's going to be parachuted there and give an opinion that he's not even himself capable of, it's unbelievable. I think that's unacceptable, and also by the fact that it's a medical problem, and without starting a war, a psychologist is not a medical doctor. So euthanasia at the legal level, euthanasia, even in the original text, it's a medical decision. So you're for the law if it would use the recommendations. Yes. And I think this law is botched. It's not precise enough. People who are for it are gonna say everything's gonna happen in good spirits and in perfect harmony. But even yesterday, I talked with someone who was for it, and who said that we don't even need to have a meeting to think about this request because we already know the patient since a while, but it's a moment important enough of his life to stop and to think. When you take a cancerous child in care, for example, the decision of starting the treatment is shared between cancerologist, radiotherapist, a surgeon, a psychologist or a pedopsychiatrist, by a team of nursing, and all those people are gonna think to the best way of taking the care. And at some point, if at some point there are complications, the same team will gather, and if at some point we decide to stop active cure and go to the palliative care, the same team is gonna meet again to be sure and that you exhausted all therapeutic options. And when we'll be at some point to face the decisions if a child should benefit from a euthanasia using lethal injections, then you wouldn't have any meeting for consensus. That's if like you would ask a judge to judge a heavy justice case doing all by himself. There is no justice court for a grave case that happens with only one judge. It's always several judges. And in Belgium, and if there is a very grave case in a court d'assises, you even have a jury to think about the future of that person who is guilty or not guilty. So you have to evaluate that with tranquility. And the amendments that are proposed, what's gonna make if they are gonna be taken in or not? It's a game of political power. What I learned is very saddening. If there are amendments that go through, the law project will go back to Senate. The Senate must send it back to the chambers, and there is a political official from one of the majority parties. If that would have to happen, they wouldn't have the time to do it in the current legislation. So it's unfortunate. that for political considerations you botched a law, and there are other recommendations of the Royal Academy of Medicine who should be followed, put into the law. The company of the parents, the opinion of the team, and the fact to offer at all points palliative care to the child, and pro-euthanasia of children, or even for adults who say that you have to be listening to the child. All the teams who take care of children who are going to die are always listening to the child, to the parents. I don't know any team who doesn't do it. Maybe at some point some mishap, because maybe a word was wrong, communicated, or an expression, some words weren't understood. That can happen, but everyone is listening to the child. Some opposants to the access to euthanasia law for children mention the fact that this kind of request comes usually from parents or from children who, seeing their sad parents, by proxy request their euthanasia. What do you answer to those people? That both are possible. In experience, there are children who want to please their parents, and at some point parents will want to please the child. There are parents who want the life at any cost when the child understands he's gonna die, and at some moments you can have a desperate child, but who doesn't understand there is a possibility to heal, but then the parents understand. We can all tell a different story, and the only way to understand how people progress, the child and the parents, is to have a meeting with several people, have meetings, and to listen what everybody heard. For example, maybe a physiotherapist, a nurse will have understood some words from the child that are very important to evaluate the euthanasia request, the state of helplessness of the child, and that's why you have to be several people in a team to see there is no pressure from one onto the other or submission in these difficult circumstances. You need a bit of wisdom at this point. Professor Desseilles, hello. You are a doctor, psychiatrist, and a psychology teacher here at the University of Namur, Belgium. We saw together the movie Das Experiment during a conference here at the university. What can you tell us about the experience of Standford that is illustrated in the movie, and how does it differentiate itself from the Milgram experience?
En effet, on a vu le film Das Experiment, que je commentais en tant que médecin psychiatre et professeur de psychologie.
Indeed, we saw the movie Das Experiment that I commented as a psychiatrist and a psychology teacher here. The experience of Standford, it's an interesting experience because Philippe Zimbardo, who was in link with Milgram, showed beyond obedience what the situation, a particular situation of imitation of a jail could provoke change of behavior in persons who were selected as healthy subjects without deviance or mental trouble. This experience was interesting, but subject to a lot of critics because it was just as a non-ethical experience that you couldn't do these days anymore. And from the words of the organizer himself, should have stopped earlier than it was, even though it was stopped much earlier than it was supposed to last. It was biased because it was only a white young man from some social layer who were not representative of the entirety of the population. So you see in those few examples that it's hard to extrapolate the situation to a real-world prison situation where dehumanization happens.
The key is it that it is progressive, or can there be triggers that can precipitate how it's going?
Alors, c'est une excellente question. Alors, la déshumanisation, telle qu'elle est étudiée dans...
Dehumanization, studied in this experience, didn't aim to provoke this phenomenon, but it's one of their observations. And they saw that people with a certain role are going to play this role in an excessive fashion, forcing other people morally, verbally, by acts to things that turn out to be inhumane. The interest of this experience, despite its bias, is to wonder about the situation beyond the human. It's a human puts in situation, and you can wonder about society problem, like it could happen in Abu Ghraib, in some places, with some policemen in Brussels, or some people in some groups. It never concerned the entirety of the population. Some people can have behavior, can have some behaviors, and after this experiment happens, we could tell the situation plays an extremely important role and can trigger dehumanization, and acts, degrading acts, inhumane acts, are going to be justified because the person was in certain role.
Psychological profile that is more vulnerable to manipulation by the authorities or by authority figures, perceived or real?
Alors c'est une excellente question. On ne peut pas dire d'une personne qu'elle soit totalement manipulable ou pas, mais
they are totally manipulable
que
or not,
certaines personnes vont être
but
plus suggestives,
fact is some
plus
people are more suggestible or influenceable. This being said,
la confiance,
trust and dependence relations are part of development of the individual, where you need to structure yourself, to progress, to have affective relations, to build your relations, to build personal development. You need trust. So you can be more vulnerable to influence. We can all imagine when you are children, you are more vulnerable, you are more suggestible. This experience, the experience of Milgram, questioning obedience and authority figures, and the experience of Standford, showing that given situation, you can have changing behaviors in the context of a jail with randomly picked guardians and prisoners. This situation can change behavior of persons who may or may not be vulnerable. Those people were divided randomly, so there is no particular factor, but maybe in their personal history you could find things. Again, what's common in this experience, it's important to know when you make a study with people, with human persons who think beyond what you can do as an experience. They will interpret the instructions. They will think something peculiar is expected of them. They will guess what the experimenter wants, wish, beyond, and that complicates the interpretation of results that you could have, as well as the setup. It's very complicated to learn to study the human subjects. Humans want to please. Beyond that, you have to interpret what the other person expects from the situation, wondering if I was put in this role means I have to behave in a certain way. And there can be a reading at several levels, as much as within the experience, where the individual says, I'm told to do that, so I have to do that. And at a larger scale, be able to read again their studies later, and the person who were in a fake prison in the Standford experiment knew that it was not a real prison. So it's not real, it's never comparable to the real world. The persons in the Milgram experience, we could tell from posterior studies, they knew it was unthinkable to request from someone in university to do a voltage so high that could kill someone. So there had to be something else. So the simple interpretation saying that those people obey when given an order or because they are in a situation is not valid, because there are talks beyond that. And the talks where the subjects were taken were to think that I wouldn't be requested this in this place, so there are all kinds of interpretations. It can give beginning of reflection tracks, but there are not ultimate experiences showing truth or a truth that could happen.
What are the best safeguards of the human critical mind against manipulation and the dilution of responsibilities in our modern Western society?
Alors là, il y a deux points importants.
There are two important points: is the dilution of responsibility and how to have limits on manipulation that could be there. There are broader questions. Manipulation is a term that it's pejorative, referring to influence and persuasion. In some sides, persuasion or influence could be favorized, whether for politic convictions or therapeutic convictions. In hypnosis, for example, you can have suggestions, and the simple fact to go to the doctor carries a suggestion that you have a problem that's going to make the solution. And before a meeting takes place, there is already influence from what you think is going to happen, what you think the other things, and the power that people have on problems. So the influence of persuasion and suggestion are ingredients in common life that are necessary in daily life. Now, in the manipulation side, there's going to be this pejorative aspect to make someone make something despite that person would wish for themselves. So aside their will, their free will. And it raised the question of conscience, free will, and the will to engage in an activity that you would want to do beyond the possible bad intention of someone else. So, how to put limits to that, I think, is first from information, knowledge, and transparency you can have on what can happen, what can be done. For example, political mechanism in any domain, the knowledge, transparency are important things. Now, information itself is subject to manipulation or influence. So it's a domain where you can keep looking mechanism to make it more transparent. There will always be an irreducible part on the level of some influence or possible manipulation, because it's part of the ingredients of the communication between humans, and you cannot separate it from communication itself.
For example, today there is image everywhere, video, photo, social media. And this study, amongst others, tells that with fabricated evidence you can induce false eyewitness testimony, meaning that someone who sees something firsthand and then shown a video with faked elements into it will tend to believe the video over their own memory over 50% of the case. Isn't that amazing? I mean,
alors c'est quelque chose de tout à fait extraordinaire.
It's something quite extraordinary,
Comme c'est le cas de la
like it's the case of memory or human brain or even human relations, even the language.
choses qui sont à la fois extraordinaires. Alors, le plus
Are all extraordinary things. The most extraordinary is that we tend to think that our memory is something solid or inflexible and not dynamic. Memory is extremely fluid, dynamic, changing. We have access to something more easily at some moments, according to with whom we are, the smells we smell. So our memory is really something dynamic and will be influenced by a lot of things, such as the image you can see, the moments of vigilance you have to remember things, the quality of sleep, the quantity of emotion in the situation, or your emotional state. You can maybe fix information or not, and pay attention to what is being said. There are a lot of elements who are going to influence memory, and memory stays extremely fluid. Once the information is stored in memory, it's not stored like it would be on a hard disk with something rigid, reproducible and reliable. Memory is highly fallible, simply and happily, because sometimes we need permanently to be able to find yourself again. There are going to be phenomena of congruence according to the mood, what you're looking for. You can see things different. In our memory is the same thing. We're gonna remember different things according to the mood we have and according to the prejudice we have. We're gonna be able to, in this example, seek some informations that you can build yourself a story, and you can very well believe to have been in a place where you've never been if you, for example, you see in a fake video yourself in that place, because there is a mechanism of self-image conservation in an attempt to gather things that are unrelated and things this is not possible, it has to be this way, and so forth. Same thing with a story that maybe you were told during all your childhood, and you can be led to believe something you were repeatedly told and where you've never been, simply because you were told it many, many times. The simple fact of telling, of believing, can lead to the fact that in your memory you have these elements, and this leads to potential difficulties in verbal testimonies, written testimonies, vision testimonies can bring up things that didn't happen, and you can be led to believe you did different things that didn't happen at all. It can raise questions at different levels. To think that the world is rigid and truth can be held back is far from the reality of memory. So it's useful to take notes. Indeed, it's useful to take notes along what you learn, and it's the basis of any meeting. A meeting report fixates what was being said. At some point something was being said doesn't mean it's the truth, but it means at some date we decided this and that, and so taking notes is a good way to remember things, of course.
How about moral violence in the workplace? What gives some people the illusion that abusive behaviors are acceptable, further than the pretext that there is no physical violence?
Alors c'est Excellente question, et qui rejoint peut-être la question de tout à l'heure à laquelle je n'ai pas répondu sur la dilution finalement de l'autorité.
This brings us back to the dilution of authority or responsibility.
Les institutions,
Institutions,
qu'elles soient des universités, des
whether it's university, administration or a company, are truly complex machinery in terms of human resources management, because not only a human can be complicated to understand, complicated to work with oneself or others. You have to imagine how organized in sometimes very complicated ways or simple ways or creative ways humans who decide to have a project together, and how is information going to circulate in terms of authority, how is authority going to be conveyed inside the institution? Why would you do such a task that you were told?
Toute la hiérarchie peut contribuer à cette figure d'autorité.
Sometimes this authority figure is well identifiable behind a name or a function, or sometimes it's very diluted, and then authority seems to be in the hands of no one, and also responsibility seems to be in the hands of no one. So the organizations can be very different, sometimes with a big transparency where you can identify who's in charge of what, and sometimes it's not so obvious. Moral difficulties an employee could encounter in contact with their team leader,
avec des personnes, des responsables qui, eux, ont su peut-être mieux gérer leur équipe.
Who could manage their team better. Sometimes they are good team leaders, managers, but sometimes there are people who make others do the work that they would want. So it's a question of influence, persuasion, or suggestion that doesn't necessarily hold into account the other person's opinion, and could be on the side of psychopathology. Maybe it's psychopath or sociopath, but in particular it would be more narcissistic persons with perversions and manipulation.
And abuse start in the workplace? Where is the line?
Alors c'est une très bonne question. Est-ce qu'il y a un cut-off?
Is there a cut-off? There is a threshold where some things are tolerable or not. And I think it's a very delicate question, because it changes according to the company, the personal tolerance to pressure, the beliefs, the values they have in there. For example, you could accept huge pressure in view of an exam or of a promotion or something that has sense. And it's all about if that person can make sense of it and is respected as a human. In similar situation, a sense can be very different in the mind of one person or another, who could find it degrading or inhumane. The threshold is something difficult, it's relative. But you can, with some good sense, common sense, tell that if there is not some non-respect of the human in any way, then a threshold is crossed. If it goes beyond normality, or when it triggers suffering, this goes outside of something human, and this is a threshold that shouldn't be crossed, especially in the workplace, where the well-being should be favorized, because well-being triggers productivity and a wish to give back to the institution that supports you, rather than forcing.
Undergo some abuse during training because he has to face life and death situations, so that's normal. But a secretary that is bossed around like a slave will make a burnout, because it's not her place to be treated like a slave, and she won't be so productive if she's treated like that than she's treated normally.
Alors ce sont vraiment, oui, c'est des exemples qui sont assez diamétralement opposés.
These are very extreme examples, but indeed, on one side one could be prepared for extreme situations and the other one not. Everyone works in different environments. Violence that has sense is different than violence that has no sense. This being said, the less violence there is, in every case, better the persons are going to feel. Again, a soldier who would be trained to undergo a certain pressure, if that pressure goes beyond some beacons, some limits, it could be also problematic, too difficult, too degrading. Then you can have as much risk there as in other places.
Is there something anybody can do to resource themselves from the pressure of the workplace and to distance themselves from manipulation by society's problems, indifference to their problems?
C'est une question très importante que de pouvoir savoir comment on peut se préparer éventuellement à des difficultés potentielles relationnelles sur son milieu de travail.
It's important to know how to manage difficulties, emotional difficulties in the workplace, and not to contaminate your own life and not to bring those difficulties at home, when you can also have personal difficulties bothering you. In a general fashion, in all circumstances, you have to be in good health, physical and psychic, to perform a work. And are there specific instructions to face those difficulties? There are general instructions for these difficulties, and in those, to be able to tell things apart, things from the situation, to be able to find solutions to problems arising, any kind of problem in the workplace. Those are extremely important things, to be able to regulate your own emotions, or to be able to shelter from emotional disturbance from colleagues or superiors, are things to which every worker should be prepared. In particular, there is nothing particular. There are general things that any worker in the workplace must put in place, must be listening, to be able to manage your own emotions, your own personal difficulties, but also understand how to be sheltered from difficulties that can arise from persons who have some authority or decision power on their work environment, so to make sure that their personal work can be made in an optimal fashion. When there are mishaps in the workplace, the studies shedding lights on this, about psychopathology, obedience, ingredients of authority, what are the ingredients of a greater violence in some environments. Some studies were published to compare how could you understand, explain. Beyond explanation or attempts at explanation of the identification of ingredients, it's important to also question yourself more globally on what are the values that are in our society. If you have to produce, from, for example, research in exacerbated fashion, and you don't take into account personal difficulties of researcher, you could imagine that it would push some to have scientific fraud, for example. So some situation that doesn't take into account the fundamental needs of the people can lead to some problems. And in that context, it's not one person who manipulates, but it's a context who doesn't take into account the need of the people and put on them too much pressure beyond one or the other individual would be dysfunctional. For some situations for which some procedure could be triggered to have meetings to solve problems. Beyond that, sometimes the institutions themselves ask a lot of things and create a system that is manipulative to request a lot of things. So the question is this a society who asks more things of the people to be competitive, or is it the context of persons?
So the systems themselves must protect their employees, their workforce, to protect themselves.
Exactly.
It's an investment from the system to think to prevent some deviance, and always think about what are the values that are cultivated from within the system. Productivity, yes, but on what cost, on what respect, on the individuals?
Dans les gares, oui, mais auquel respect des individus les plus faibles et les plus vulnérables. Donc,
and so to see and maybe anticipate problems by saying that some persons in some situation might have access across certain threshold that is not acceptable for others and that is dysfunctional.
And what can the individual persons do so to protect their family when they go home, not to discharge the stress from work onto their families?
That is also extremely important.
We saw a campaign on Belgian TV about that.
How to... It's a displacement phenomenon in the defense mechanism, in the psychodynamic model of the mental health. How will you not displace the aggressivity and tensions from that you live during the day at work on your loved ones, or on your pets, on your things? The question is, questions come to be how to not contaminate with your moods, or it's a very difficult question because no one would want to prevent some others to tell the good news they had during the day, and when it's something negative, it should be managed on the workplace itself in an aseptic fashion. So in some way it doesn't really take into account how humans work. When you are emotionated by something, touched by something, persons will want to have their preferred defense mechanism to manage this difficulty, and this difficulty management must have the lesser possible impact on environment and loved ones at home. If there is too much of a big impact with negative consequences, it is clear that it goes beyond the framework of the workplace, and the management, the emotional management induced by fair or unfair situation in the workplace becomes difficult for the persons, and there frequently is the individuals who are going to seek help, maybe, or care, and it's not the systems who are going to be questions. Does the health interest itself in the fact that 10 people come to the same place to identify dysfunction in a system or in an institution? This belongs to the work doctor of the institution or the networks to be able to ask this question, but the individual who is suffering may or may not be consulting to get out of the situation. Again, to have defense against difficulties, you have to know your own preferred defense mechanism, and to know how do you usually manage difficult situations that you meet at workplace, And do you tend to think, not to think, to be impulsive or more aggressive? So you have to work directly on those difficulties. All the while, not to spare the question of better managing difficulties and not to contaminate your closed ones. And you don't have to spare the question, does this system not have too much pressure? Isn't there a wider problem? So there is always several levels, the individual level and the systemic level, and on all levels you have to ask the question, not to miss the essential question. At the same time, the suffering person who suffers and may make others suffer, or at the systemic level, how does the system, how can the system be adapted to reach a better productivity, but keeping in mind the respect of the worker and the workplace and the individual. There is certainly a team effort to be made at this level.
Welcome back. I hope you had interest in the topics developed in this episode of Bioethics in Motion. Feel free to engage in debate in the comments below. Also, I would like to hear from you. What subjects would you like to have investigated in the next episode of Bioethics in Motion? Send me an email to ben@bmphotography.pro. I will select 3 topics and prepare them for the next episode. For now, I'm thanking you for watching this show, and I'm telling you until next time. Bye bye.